Hello everyone. This video is part 4 in a series of videos about a deeply transphobic article that was posted by the BBC on their website. I'd recommend that you go and watch those 3 first if you need to get up to speed, since I'm going to jump right in at the deep end here. But do not worry if you watch those videos and get the impression that you may have missed out on the opportunity to complain, because as always, there is something new to complain about today. So, the BBC have finally responded to the complaints sent to their Executive Complaints Unit, and they did so in a general statement posted to their complaints page titled, "We're being pressured into sex by some trans women, bbc.co.uk, finding by the head of the Executive Complaints Unit, ECU." This is a long statement that seeks to address various different complaints that were raised against the article, and if we're being nice, we can call it a mixed bag. So, let's start with what I suppose we can call the good news and talk about the 2 major concessions that have been made by the BBC. Firstly, the response says, "The principal issue of complaint in relation to accuracy was that the evidential basis for suggesting pressure from trans women posed a significant problem for lesbians was inadequate. In this connection, the head of the ECU noted that the headline, 'We're being pressured into sex by some trans women,' which was not written by the author of the article, gave the impression that the focus of the article would be on pressure applied by trans women, whereas its focus was at least as much on internalized pressure experienced by some lesbians as a result of a climate of opinion, as they perceived it, within the LGBT community, rather than pressure directly applied by trans women." In the head of the ECU's view, the headline gave a somewhat misleading impression of the article itself, and it appeared from many of the complaints that this had contributed to an understanding of the article as more focused on the conduct of trans women than was in fact the case. To that extent, it fell below the BBC's standards of due accuracy. And as a result of this, the title of the article has been changed to "The Lesbians Who Feel Pressured to Have Sex and Relationships with Trans Women." And this is a point I discussed way back in my first video about this article. The original title gave the impression that pressure was being applied by trans women specifically, but then the article and attached survey fail to evidence this, spending much more time talking about an indirect social pressure felt by certain cis lesbians. So the BBC have changed the headline of the article to make it more accurate to what they now claim the article is about. I say what they now claim the article is about because I'm not willing to go along with their logic that the original headline was not suited to the article's intent. Whatever they claim the article is about now, its intent is to attack trans women and launder anti-trans propaganda from hate groups that want to take away the rights of trans people. It is not the case, as the BBC would now have you believe, that the article is in fact about something else. It is intended to paint trans women as villains, they just failed to properly evidence the claim, and so now they've been forced to change the headline. Also, if we go along with the BBC's claim here that the topic under discussion is actually a pressure felt by cis lesbians rather than a pressure applied by trans women, then a whole new problem arises with the article. But let's put a pin in that for a second and first talk about the other concession from the BBC, which concerns the Get the L Out questionnaire. And I quote, "The Get the L Out questionnaires findings, as reported in the article, for example that 56% of those who responded reported being pressured or coerced to accept a trans woman as a sexual partner, tended to give the impression that pressure to have sex with trans women, whether from individual trans women or from an activist consensus, was a widespread or even a majority experience among lesbians." In the head of the ECU's judgment, however, it provided an insufficient basis for that impression. The questionnaire was sent to a small number of women-only and lesbian-only groups, and only around a third of its 80 respondents were from the UK. The article included some caveats, however these did not seem to us to go far enough to make clear to readers the survey's lack of statistical validity, or the extent to which Get the L Out has an agenda, which the results of the survey appear to serve. To the extent that the article failed to exercise the appropriate degree of skepticism in its treatment of the survey, it fell below the BBC's standards of due accuracy. And as a result of this finding, the article has been amended to include a description of the survey as being not statistically valid. Now this is a relative good, but it still falls short of the only acceptable response here, which is to delete the entire article and apologise. I mean, it's getting a bit embarrassing, right? If we consider the whole article's history, they've had to drop their biggest contributor for being a transphobe with a history of sexually assaulting women. They've been forced to change the title for falling below their standards of due accuracy. They've had to admit their main source of data is biased and statistically invalid. So why does this article still exist? The ECU response even concludes that despite all this, the piece is still, quote, a legitimate piece of journalism overall. And I'd like to remind everyone of the BBC's earlier response to the initial complaints sent about the article, where they claimed the article was carefully considered before publication and went through an internal editorial review process. And did it? Because, and I'm forced to point out the obvious here, but they didn't do a very good job, did they? Not only did they not catch the instances in which the ECU response declares the article to have fallen below the BBC's accuracy standards, Lily Cade's sexual assault allegations were public knowledge before this article was published, and they didn't catch that either. I think the BBC's internal review process needs an external review, because this article never should have made it to publication. And I really dislike the slimy way they refuse to admit anything they'd have to issue an apology for. For instance, on the issue of Lily Cade's sexual assault allegations, they merely say they escaped attention, and then later they came to light. Yes, they came to light when people did your job for you and told you about publicly available information that you could have discovered with a basic Google search. Internal editorial review process, my foot. So that was the good news. Now let's talk about the points where I disagree with the ECU response. And there's a few of these. And in no particular order, let's start with their defense of the decision to not mention the reasons why Lily Cade was cut from the article. And I quote, "A number of complainants considered the update did not give sufficient detail of the reason why Miss Cade's contribution had been removed, but the BBC has to consider how to describe offensive material without repeating and perpetuating any offence it may cause. And the head of the ECU believed the absence of detail was justified in this instance." Now this response reveals a blatant double standard. If we consider this claim in isolation, we can say, sure, maybe to avoid causing offence, the BBC didn't want to bring up Lily Cade's violent threats and sexual assaults unnecessarily, so they simply used euphemisms and called them comments and inappropriate behaviour. Fair enough. However, we're not considering this claim in isolation. This amendment is attached to an article which contains several descriptions of both violent threats and sexual assaults. The first sentence of the article is describing a death threat, in fact, and none of these are described euphemistically. So why does the BBC's responsibility to describe offensive material without repeating and perpetuating any offence it may cause not apply here? Why isn't there an absence of detail when it comes to the violence and sexual assault described in the text of the article? The answer to these rhetorical questions is that whatever the BBC says, the point of this article is to attack trans women and paint them as presenting some unique danger to cis lesbians, and describing Lily Cade's behaviours would undermine that point. So it's okay to talk about death threats and rape when you're attributing those things to anonymous trans women, but when it's a cis lesbian doing those things, those exact same things, suddenly, after thousands of words of talking about these topics openly, we're now all of a sudden concerned about offence, so we can't repeat what Lily Cade did to get removed from the article. What a load of shit. The ECU response really starts tying itself in knots when trying to wriggle out of admitting the article may have contributed to discrimination against trans people. They really do not want to admit that possibility, and so treat us to some advanced mental gymnastics. See if you can follow this. The BBC's guidelines on harm and offence and portrayal say that the content broadcast or published by the BBC may reflect, but should not perpetuate, the prejudice which exists in our society, and that output which includes views which might incite hatred or cause offence must have a clear editorial justification and include appropriate challenge and/or appropriate context. In judging how far the article complied with these editorial standards, the head of the ECU first considered the extent to which it concerned behaviour which would be likely to convey a harmful and negative impression of those said to be engaged in it. He noted that, though the concept of pressure to have sex, invoked by the headline, could be regarded as implying impropriety on the part of those supposedly applying the pressure, there is nevertheless a distinction between coercion, which would generally be regarded as reprehensible, and persuasion or advocacy, and that there could well be instances where one party experienced as pressure what the other party regarded in good faith as legitimate persuasion. The article included one instance of behaviour which could only be regarded as coercive, if accurately reported, in the case of the unnamed respondent to the Get the L Out questionnaire who claimed to have been raped by a trans woman, but there was no suggestion that this reflected on the behaviour of trans women in general. This is the same questionnaire, let me remind you, that includes the quote, "all transsexuals rape women's bodies," but there is no suggestion that this reflects on the behaviour of trans women in general, of course. What the BBC is saying here is that the article's original title, "We're being pressured into sex by some trans women," only could be regarded as conveying a harmful or negative impression of trans women because, they say, there's a distinction between coercion and persuasion. And as we all know, the phrase pressure into sex is exactly midway between coercion and persuasion. It could mean rape, it could mean flirting. Who knows? So this headline has a neutral connotation, apparently. It's supposed to draw you in by making you curious. You're supposed to ask, oh, I wonder if they're talking about the bad version of pressuring someone into sex, or the good version of pressuring someone into sex. There's just no way to infer either a positive or negative connotation from these words, apparently. Awful. Perhaps the worst instance of the BBC deliberately overlooking blatant transphobia comes when they say that the head of the ECU, quote, found no example of misgendering or bioessentialist language in the author's own words. Well, head of the ECU, allow me to point one out for you. Some complainants drew attention to what they regarded as misgendering or bioessentialist language offensive to trans people. Of the examples given, one seemed to the head of the ECU to rest on a misconception. The contributor Jennie was quoted as saying, "I've had someone saying they would rather kill me than Hitler," and so on. And her use of "they" was understood by some as deliberately casting doubt on the gender of a trans woman. However, Jennie said nothing to indicate that the comments in question were made by a trans woman, and the head of the ECU saw no basis for assuming that they had been. Consequently, he did not accept that this was an instance of misgendering. So, fair enough so far. Maybe when this contributor used "they" to refer to someone else, she wasn't referring to a trans woman, and so using "they" was justified and therefore not misgendering. However, there is a very similar case in the article that goes completely unmentioned in the ECU response, and it's this. Another reported a trans woman physically forcing her to have sex after they went on a date. They threatened to out me as a TERF and risk my job if I refused to sleep with them, she wrote, and so on. Now, the article says "they" in brackets here because the original quote from the Get the L Out survey uses "he," of course. So, the author of this piece, Carolyn Lowbridge, identified someone as a trans woman in the text, and then in her own words, changed the pronoun used to refer to that person to "they." Now, whatever we think of that, the head of the ECU describes this as misgendering, and this passage certainly wasn't missed because the quote is referred to elsewhere in the response. So what's happened here is that the BBC received a bunch of complaints about the article misgendering trans women and has chosen to deliberately attribute all of those complaints to one instance in which there is ambiguity as to the gender of the person being described, and then they completely ignored another instance in which there is no such ambiguity. And I'd ask that you remember this bit of the video because it's going to come up again at the end. I want now to talk about the point I mentioned earlier when talking about the decision to change the headline of the article, and let me first quote you a section of the ECU response. Some complainants argued that it was inaccurate and misleading for the author to write, "In addition to Veronica Ivy, I contacted several other high-profile trans women who have either written or spoken about sex and relationships. None of them wanted to speak to me, on the grounds that Chelsea Poe had agreed to be interviewed, though in the event no extracts from the interview were used in the article. Whether the description high profile fits a particular trans woman is clearly a matter of judgment in which there may be a subjective element." Now, we've been through this before. There is in fact no subjective element if you name other supposedly high-profile sources who have a smaller profile than Chelsea Poe, but that's not actually what I'm interested in here. You see, this response goes on to say, "Nor did he believe the question materially affected the point being made by the author, based as it was on contacting 10 trans women she regarded as high profile, and who would have represented the view that lesbians should be open to dating trans women." Now this is what I want to examine here in relation to the change in headline. This article seeks to describe a division between cis lesbians and trans women in a way that is clearly unfavourable to trans women, and as such the original headline of the article suited that intent perfectly. Cis lesbians versus trans women is how the article is framing its debate. So, with cis lesbians providing one view, the author obviously reaches out to trans women to provide the opposing view. But now, with the headline change, the BBC is saying, oh no, you got the wrong end of the stick there. This article isn't about trans women pressuring people into sex. It's actually mainly about cis lesbians who don't want to date trans women feeling an indirect social pressure to do so. Now, if this is the case, the group who should be being contacted by the author to provide the opposing view here is not trans women at all. It's cis lesbians who are open to dating trans women, and or those who don't feel a specific social pressure to do so. They should be offering the other opinion here, because as we know, many cis lesbians are fine with dating trans women, but not one of them is quoted in the article. There's no mention that the author attempted to contact anyone who fits that description, or did any research at all into the views of cis lesbians who are fine with dating trans women. There's no "none of them wanted to speak to me" excuse this time. They're not in the article because the author didn't contact them, because it would have undermined the actual reason the article exists, which is to hurt trans women. To sum up my point here, if the article exists for the reason the BBC says it does, then they have completely failed the basic journalistic responsibility to provide an alternate point of view. Now, I've got many more points I could make about this response, but my last main one is to note that the head of the ECU disagrees that Chelsea Poe informed the BBC about the actions and opinions of Lily Cade prior to the article's publication. But frankly, after considering all the other deliberate oversights in this response, I just don't trust the BBC to hear something that they don't want to hear. I don't trust their evaluation of what counts as transphobia, and given that the BBC refuses to release the audio of the interview with Chelsea Poe, I hope that Ofcom are willing and able to investigate the actual truth there. Which brings us to the next step in the complaints process, which is to talk to Ofcom, the UK's communications regulator. I'll post a link below to their complaints form, which looks like this, and I'd encourage anyone who's been along for the ride so far to fill out that form, if they have the inclination to, of course. Ofcom will usually only respond if you've already complained to the BBC, and the BBC has issued a final word on the matter, which has now happened in this case. Now, how you fill out this form is going to be specific to your own individual complaints about the article, but I will give a couple of notes. Firstly, if you have your BBC response case number, remember to include that. It will be in the email correspondence that you got from the BBC. Next, Ofcom appears to require you to submit the BBC's final response to you in the form of an attachment, which is weird. It's on the BBC's website, and I tried to just link to it, but it wouldn't let me proceed without attaching something. You should be able to download the email from the BBC pointing you to the ECU response as a file and then attach that. Failing that, you can copy the text of the BBC response into a word processor document, save it, and attach that file, I suppose. But I'm not just going to be contacting Ofcom today. I'm also going to be submitting a new complaint to the BBC, a complaint about the ECU response. This complaint is going to be about the issue of misgendering that we talked about earlier. You see, the Executive Complaints Unit got lazy when trying to dismiss the complaints about misgendering, and they argued themselves into a corner. As we talked about earlier, they pretended all instances of misgendering were referencing a use of the word they when referring to someone whose gender is unknown, and they ignored the times the author uses they in brackets to refer to someone she has already identified as a trans woman. And let me be candid about the strategy here. You might say, why focus on only one instance of misgendering, considering the many other problems with the response? But my aim here is to make them amend the article again, because the more times they have to amend the article, the closer they will get, I hope, to giving up on it and taking it down. And by focusing on only one issue, I hope to avoid giving them opportunities to wriggle out of offering a specific response. If I complain about 10 things, they'll only respond to the few things they feel most able to counter, and the rest will be lost. So I'm hoping to exploit the misstep in the ECU response with a precision strike. I'm going to be complaining only about their ignoring of an instance of what can be proved by their own statements to be misgendering. I'll include the text of my new complaint below and would highly, highly recommend that, if you feel like it, you also contact the BBC with your own complaint about this ECU response, either on the same issue or any other issue that you'd like to focus on. I will put the link to their complaints page in the video description below. I know I'm asking a lot of you all with all of these complaints, but we've got them on the run right now, so let's keep the pressure up. So I'm going to go to the complaints link below, I'm going to select BBC website or apps, another BBC website or app, I'm going to paste the link to the ECU response, which is included below. Then, are you contacting us about a previous complaint? No. On the next page, I'm going to select factual error or inaccuracy, I suppose, and for a title, I'm going with ECU finding ignores instance of misgendering. In the next box, I'm going to paste the text of my complaint, which you can read below, and then I'm going to select, do you require a response to your complaint? Yes. So here's to another 6 months. With how slow the BBC have been replying, we'll probably be elevating this new complaint to Ofcom around Christmas. Thanks a lot for watching, folks. One more note before I go though. I'd like to make clear that I'm not the only person kicking up a fuss here. Lots of people, particularly trans people, have been doing a much better job than I can raising awareness about this article, and I'd particularly point to Trans Activism UK's excellent written response to the ECU response, which I will also link below. I just thought I'd mention that here after seeing a few comments about me leading a charge and such. I am supporting a charge. I'm just part of a general charge. Right, thanks folks, I'll see you next time.